Hello again, world history students. So this video is designed to just introduce us to the basic foundations of the Middle Ages. So you should have spent a significant amount of time in this era in middle school. And so this should largely be a refresher for you on the big concepts that we're going to build upon as we continue through the rest of this unit. So the first big question I get a lot of times is, what does medieval mean? Why do we call this the Middle Ages? And so medieval, and the short answer there, it just means middle. It's an older English version for the word referring to middle. And so then we talk about, well, why do we call this the Middle Ages? And so what you see on your screen is basically a timeline of what is going on. And if we're taking all of world history and simplifying it about as simple as we can get it, what we're going to find is there's about three main giant eras of world history. So the first one we look at, okay, we've got the old world. So about the time humans civilized up until around 800. So if you're not familiar, that little C stands for circa. It just means around. So around 7000 BCE until about 800 CE. And we often call those the ancient times, the classical civilizations. On the other end, we can look on the far right side, and we're going to call that our modern times. So starting around 1500 CE up until today, I'm shooting this video in October of 2020. And so from 1500 until today, there's been a lot of ways that are ways of thinking, ways of guiding our worldview that were established in the 1500s and have continued to develop over that time. So then we say, well, what do we call the time in between the old classical civilizations until the world now? And so not creative at all, they call it the Middle Ages. And so we can see that time where we're not really old world anymore, but we're not quite to where we think about things yet. And so those years are all very rough. The end of the Middle Ages starts to come in various times. So we'll talk a lot about the year 1453 and 1492 as significant turning points to end the Middle Ages and move towards modern ways of thinking. But those are really rough dates tied to a series of events that represent these ways of thinking. So that's why we call this the middle. We're no longer in the old world. That was something that you should have spent a lot of time in middle school covering. We're just doing a quick review of a few concepts of the Middle Ages before we can look at how those concepts of the Old World and the Middle Ages have influenced the ways of thinking that really guide us now. So the other way I always start units is making sure you know where in the world we're talking about. And so what we're doing is we want to take this global perspective we started with and start to zoom in. And we're going to zoom in for the first part of this on the Mediterranean Sea. So if you're not familiar with the Mediterranean, if you can see my mouse here, it's this center body that's also labeled on your map. And we can see there's a lot of trade centers clustered in this area around the Mediterranean Sea also. So if we zoom in on that one, our big focus is going to be on a lot of the events of Europe, what's going on down here in Southeast Asia, as well as Southwest Asia, I apologize. So Southwest Asia, including Turkey and what's now Saudi Arabia. And we will end up having some connections to Asia and to Africa as we proceed through the unit too. So the first thing I wanted to do is look at what's been going on. We've already talked about what's been happening in China on the earlier side of this. So let's contrast that to what's been going on in Europe. And so this is where you should make sure that you are getting some notes down about what's going on specifically in Europe. So everything on the China side is all labeled already because it's stuff that you already know about this time frame. And we're just contrasting, so what's going on in China, and now how is Europe different? So as you already know, China has found this new era of peace and stability, and they are in their golden age. And this is a total and complete opposite to Europe that has found itself in one of the eras in its history where they are broken into so many tiny little factions and constantly fighting against each other. We saw that in China. We saw that China could resolve that through their harsh government, as we talked about in our first unit. But Europe hasn't figured that out yet. And so what Europe knows is everyone is fighting against everybody else. And while I might have a ruler who I'm loyal to, even those things start to change sometimes. And so what they know is if everyone's always fighting, everyone is looking for a way to be protected. And so once again, everyone is looking for a way to be protected. if you are considering whether I'm a rich person with a lot of land or I'm a small farmer that only has a tiny plot of land that I need to feed my family, I want to make sure that I have someone that's going to protect me from that next invasion and the invasion after that, because they are still coming. And so this is where we see the creation of a lot of Middle Ages types of concepts like knights, these horseback warriors wearing their giant suits of armor, and castles being these centers of culture in a lot of ways, but also where people can come in and hide behind walls. And there's essentially military fortresses popped up all over Europe because we're going to need protection for that next invasion. As we look ahead again in China, we know that their emperor has taken all the power and centralized power as one giant bureaucracy where all the powers go into the emperor. Europe is completely the opposite. Europe is using a system we call the feudal system. And so now that we already know about a bureaucracy, we're adding a new word to that. So the feudal system is a decentralized bureaucracy. So what that means is it's the opposite of what we saw in China. In China, we saw a bureaucracy where the emperor was basically in the center, and he could give orders to people all around him and get everything taken care of. In Europe, there's no center to the bureaucracy. You have a bunch of smaller bureaucracies, each operating separately from each other. And so that concept is still there, but they're smaller. You have maybe a small territory and they have a small bureaucracy governing their territory, but then their neighbors have a different bureaucracy with a different leader in charge. And that leads to more fighting as these two leaders try to get more power over each other. So now what we have is everybody else who's stuck in the middle. And so all these other people stuck in the middle are scrambling. They are trying to find a way that they can get protection from someone higher up than them in this bureaucracy. And so everyone is looking for protection from someone that's just a little more powerful than they are. But protection isn't free. And so one of the big keys with the feudal system is people provide a service in exchange for protection. And so as you're looking at these notes once again, and you see that bullet underneath there, people provide a service in exchange for protection from someone more powerful than them. So then we have two social classes, and we pretty much only have two social classes as this time starts up. So it starts with the nobles. The nobles are the upper class. They are separated by basically a bloodline. So you are either a noble or you're the lower class, so the peasants, which will become serfs. So the nobles are generally landowners. They generally have people working for them, but there's a whole different level. So you have kings and they're nobles, but you might also have a noble who only has as much land as, we'll just say, the city of Valley Park for reference, and has to manage that, compared to another noble that manages an entire country. And so those smaller nobles are also looking for protection. And so the deals that they make for protection is nobles will fight in the army of someone more powerful than they are. And so they become one soldier in an army, and then that entire army will now protect them and all the land around it. And so we're going to see these large armies centered around this decentralized bureaucracy where you have one powerful person, and they are essentially served in the army by these other nobles who are wanting to make sure their land is also protected. It is only the nobles who fight during the Middle Ages because fighting's expensive. You need to have an expensive suit of armor, an expensive sword. You need to be able to have a horse and maintain that horse and the people who will help take care of the horse. And so the nobles are the soldiers of the time, and they're fighting so that their land is taken care of and protected. But then you have everybody else, the people who don't have a lot of money, who are just working a normal life on the farm, trying to take care of themselves. And so what they end up doing is saying, hey, if I want protection, that noble above me wants more land because land is wealth, land is power. And so they will give up their land to that noble in exchange for more protection. And when they do that, they become a serf. And so Serfs will farm on their noble's land in exchange for protection. So they farm on their noble's land in exchange for protection. Now, what that means, though, is they gave up their own land in exchange for protection. And since they gave it up, they also gave up their freedom. So part of becoming a serf is you are not allowed to leave the land. Your life is now basically dictated by this noble, and they were willing to give that up because there is so much war going on that they were desperate to find some protection. And so that's the other key when we're talking about serfs. They are working their noble's land, but they're also not allowed to leave that land. And so there's a lot of aspects of their daily life that are completely controlled by the noble. So the last characteristic is what's going on culturally. So we know that China has had this explosion of ideas in their golden age. Europe is entering what a lot of people will refer to as a dark age. They're going to be less scientific advancement for two reasons. One reason is they're so focused on fighting, and when you're fighting all the time, you're not developing things nearly as much because you're worried about protection. The other is that the religious views become such a dominant factor of the culture that they become more focused on, when they're not fighting, they're working through the religion. And so we see a huge focus on the Catholic Church. And while it has changed along the way, if you're familiar with the Catholic Church, that's an organization that's been around shortly after Christianity was formed until modern day. So this becomes a very powerful organization in the Middle Ages also. So as we continue to proceed through this unit, it's important that you know that they are also their own bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy is having an influence over the religion and the spiritual beliefs of the people throughout Europe. So that's that bureaucracy of the Catholic Church. The head of that one is the Pope. And so that's a title for the head of the Catholic Church. So you see here on the screen, that is Pope Francis. So here in October of 2020, that is the current Pope for the Catholic Church. So they have continued to have one leader who oversees the entire church and every Catholic person, or every person of the Catholic faith around the world. In the Middle Ages, the Pope, we should know, is the head of the Catholic Church. In the Middle Ages, the Pope holds power over the kings. And while that's not something that happens in the world now, that was a huge part of gaining power in the Middle Ages. And that's what you're seeing on the older picture on the left, is the Pope would actually give the power to the rulers. And in doing so, the ruler now protects the church. And the ruler also has more authority because the church has now said, God has chosen you to be the king. And so the people will now have more respect for the king's authority. So we should have by now, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church. He holds power over kings in the Middle Ages. He gives power to the rulers, as a similar idea to that. He can also cause people to rebel against the king. There are a lot of political tools that, since the king was given power by the Pope can then use other ways of using the power of religion to cause people to rebel against the king. And there are numerous cases throughout the Middle Ages where the kings are forced to change what they're wanting to do because of the people's influence from religion. And the other key factor at this time is there will be other beliefs that start to work their way in. And so another influence of the Catholic Church during the time of the Middle Ages is to work to make sure that it is the only faith in Europe. By making sure it's the only faith in Europe, they can continue to have a greater influence over both the spiritual needs of the people, as well as that political influence of being able to control the government. So what we're seeing as we're looking through this is there are a lot of differences between China entering this golden age, China going in this era of peace and stability and advancement, whereas we are seeing Europe largely focused on fighting and doing everything they can to maintain protection throughout this. As we continue to work through this unit, you are going to see how all of these pieces really guide the decisions that are being made. And this, as we're leaving this time, will start to show us how the world is forming into the way that it is now. So as always, if you have any questions or concerns after watching this, please reach out and let me know what those are. Otherwise, I will see you all soon.